Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest. I'm so glad you're here with me today for another tale of betrayal, obsession, and aristocratic revenge. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing our community span across continents. Tonight's story takes us to the glittering ballrooms of 1855 London, where a woman of 40 has been publicly humiliated for 2 decades. Too old, too stubborn, too unmarriageable. But what society doesn't know is that the most feared duke in England has been watching her since the day she refused him. And tonight, after 20 years of cold, calculated patience, he's finally ready to claim what was always meant to be his. They whispered when she entered the Ashworth ball alone again. They laughed when she stood near the windows, unclaimed and unnoticed. But when the Duke of Redmoor crossed the marble floor and extended his gloved hand to her, when his dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made the entire room fall silent, everything changed. What had he been waiting for all these years? And why her when he could have had anyone? Let me take you back to that cold November evening in 1855, where the air smelled of beeswax candles and expensive perfume, and where one woman's life was about to be rewritten by the hands of a man who had been plotting his revenge for far longer than anyone knew. The ballroom of Ashworth House blazed with 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in the gilt-framed mirrors that lined the cream-colored walls. November rain drummed against the tall windows, a rhythmic counterpoint to the orchestra's waltz. Lavinia Hartwell stood near one of those windows, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the velvet curtain, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She was 40 years old, unmarried, and utterly invisible, or so she had convinced herself over the past 2 decades. The whispers had started the moment she'd arrived. They always did. Lady Pemberton's voice, sharp as cut glass, had carried across the entrance hall. Good heavens, is that Lavinia Hartwell? Still attending these events at her age? How quaint. Mrs. Ashford had tittered behind her fan. One would think she'd have the dignity to retire to the country by now. 40 and unwed. It's unseemly. Lavinia had learned long ago not to flinch. She had perfected the art of standing perfectly still, her spine straight, her expression serene, while the poison-tipped words flew past her like arrows. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk tonight, cut in a style that was elegant but not fashionable, expensive but not ostentatious. Her dark hair, only lightly threaded with silver, was arranged in a simple chignon. She wore no jewelry save for a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother. She looked, as she always did, like a woman who had stopped trying. But appearances, as Lavinia well knew, were often deceiving. Aunt Lavinia! A bright voice broke through her reverie. Her niece, Rosalind, appeared at her elbow, radiant in white muslin and seed pearls. At 18, Rosalind was everything Lavinia had never been: beautiful, vivacious, sought after. She had been engaged for 3 months to the younger son of an earl, a match that had sent Lavinia's sister-in-law into raptures of self-congratulation. Rosalind, Lavinia said warmly, turning to embrace the girl. You look lovely tonight. As do you, Rosalind said loyally, though her eyes flickered with something that might have been pity. Have you danced yet? No, nor do I expect to. But surely, it's quite all right, dear. I'm perfectly content to observe. This was the script. This was the role Lavinia had been playing for 20 years. The spinster aunt, the unclaimed woman, the one who stood at the edges of ballrooms and made pleasant conversation while younger women twirled across the dance floor in the arms of eligible men. England in 1855 was not a kind place for unmarried women of a certain age. Lavinia understood this with a clarity that came from lived experience. A woman who reached 25 without securing a husband was considered to be on the shelf, a phrase that made women sound like forgotten objects gathering dust. By 30, she was an object of pity. By 40, she was an embarrassment to her family, a cautionary tale whispered to younger girls. This is what happens when you're too particular, when you refuse good offers, when you think too much of yourself. What these whispering matrons didn't know, what no one knew, was that Lavinia had refused only one offer in her entire life. But it had been the offer that mattered. She had been 20 years old, in her second season, already considered a bit odd for her love of books and her tendency to speak her mind. Her father had been a gentleman of modest means, enough to secure her a season in London but not enough to make her a particularly attractive prospect. She had been pretty enough, intelligent certainly, but lacking the fortune or family connections that might have compensated for her unfortunate habit of having opinions. And then, at Lady Worthing's ball in the spring of 1835, she had caught the eye of Cassian Thorne, Duke of Redmoor. Even now, 20 years later, the memory made her breath catch. He had been 22 then, newly come into his title after his father's sudden death. The Redmoor dukedom was one of the oldest and wealthiest in England, its estates spanning 3 counties, its influence reaching into the highest circles of government and society. The young duke was already known for his cold intelligence, his ruthless management of his properties, and his complete disdain for the social games that govern the ton. He had asked her to dance. Not once, but 3 times that season. He had called on her at her father's townhouse. He had engaged her in conversations about philosophy and literature, subjects that made other young ladies' eyes glaze over but which sparked something fierce and alive in Lavinia's chest. And then, in the garden at the Marlborough ball, with the scent of roses heavy in the June air, he had asked her to marry him. She had said no. The reasons had seemed so clear at the time. She was 20 and terrified. He was a duke and she was nobody. His reputation was already fearsome. People spoke of his cold anger, his unwillingness to tolerate fools, his exacting standards. Marriage to him would mean a life under constant scrutiny, every word and action judged, every mistake magnified. She would be expected to produce an heir, to manage great households, to move in circles where her modest upbringing would mark her as inferior. More than that, she had been afraid of the way he made her feel. The intensity of his attention had been intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. When he looked at her, she felt stripped bare, as if he could see every secret thought, every hidden fear. She had felt herself beginning to lose her carefully maintained composure, to want things she couldn't even name. So she had refused him, gently, apologetically, but firmly. "I am deeply honored, Your Grace," she had said, her voice shaking only slightly. "But I cannot accept. I don't believe we would suit." He had stood perfectly still in the moonlit garden, his face unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he had inclined his head. "I see," he had said quietly. "Then I wish you every happiness, Miss Hartwell." He had walked away, and Lavinia had returned to the ballroom with her heart pounding and her hands trembling, convinced she had made the right choice. She had been certain he would marry someone else within the year. A man of his rank and fortune could have his pick of the most beautiful, accomplished women in England. Surely her refusal would be forgotten within a season. But the Duke of Redmoor had not married. Not that year. Not the next. Not in any of the 20 years that had followed. Lavinia had watched from an increasing distance as her own prospects dwindled and died. There had been 1 or 2 other offers, from gentlemen of lesser rank and smaller fortunes, but none that had stirred anything in her heart. She had refused them too, and her father had grown first disappointed, then resigned, then quietly bitter. When he died 7 years ago, he had left her with a small independence, just enough to live modestly but not enough to be comfortable. She resided now in a narrow townhouse in an unfashionable part of London, kept by a single maid-of-all-work. She lived on the edges of society, invited to events because she was connected by blood to more prosperous relations, tolerated because she made no demands and caused no trouble. The spinster aunt, the cautionary tale, and through it all, the Duke of Redmoor had remained unmarried. She had seen him occasionally over the years, always at a distance. He attended parliamentary sessions and formal court functions but rarely appeared at the kind of social events where they might encounter each other. When he did, he never approached her, never even looked in her direction, as far as she could tell. The gossip about him had only intensified with time. He was called the coldest man in England, the most feared. His estates were said to be run with ruthless efficiency, his servants terrified of displeasing him, his business rivals crushed without mercy. He had no close friends, no confidants. He lived alone in his massive London house and his even more massive country seat, attended by an army of servants but touched by no warmth, no intimacy. The matchmaking mamas had long since given up on him. At 38, if he had wanted to marry, he would have done so. Clearly, he preferred his solitary existence. Lavinia had told herself she felt nothing about this, that the Duke's choices were no concern of hers, that she had made her decision 20 years ago and must live with the consequences, just as he had made his. But tonight, standing in the Ashworth ballroom with the rain drumming against the windows and the whispers swirling around her like smoke, she felt the weight of those 20 years pressing down on her shoulders. "Aunt Lavinia, you've gone quite pale. Are you unwell?" Rosalind's concerned voice broke through her thoughts. "I'm perfectly well, dear. Perhaps just a bit warm. I think I'll step out onto the terrace for some air. But it's raining. Only lightly, and there's a covered portion. Don't worry about me. Go and enjoy yourself." Rosalind hesitated, then nodded and allowed herself to be swept away by a young gentleman requesting a dance. Lavinia made her way through the crowd, invisible as always. The terrace was indeed covered by a stone portico, and blessedly empty. She stepped out into the cold November air and drew in a deep breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The rain had softened to a mist. Beyond the terrace, the gardens of Ashworth House stretched out into darkness, the bare branches of the trees black against the clouded sky. The music and laughter from the ballroom seemed distant, muffled. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of honesty. She was tired, bone-tired, not just from this evening, but from all the evenings, all the years of maintaining her composure, of pretending she didn't notice the whispers and the pitying looks, of convincing herself that she had made the right choice and that her life, while modest and lonely, was acceptable. "Miss Hartwell." The voice came from the shadows at the far end of the terrace. Lavinia's eyes flew open. Her heart stopped. A man stepped into the light spilling from the ballroom windows. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black evening clothes. Dark hair silvered at the temples. A face that was harder than she remembered, more severe, but unmistakable. Cassian Thorne, Duke of Redmoor, the most feared man in England. And he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your Grace." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She sank into a curtsy, years of training overriding her shock. "I didn't realize anyone else was out here. I noticed you leave the ballroom. I thought perhaps we might speak." "Speak." She straightened slowly, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. "We haven't spoken in 20 years, Your Grace. What could we possibly have to say to one another?" He moved closer, his footsteps nearly silent on the stone. The light from the ballroom cast shadows across his face, making him look even more forbidding. When he was close enough that she could see the silver in his dark eyes, he stopped. "I have waited a very long time for this conversation, Miss Hartwell. I don't understand." "Don't you?" His voice was soft, dangerous. 20 years ago, you refused my offer of marriage. You told me we would not suit. I accepted your decision. I walked away, but I never stopped watching you." The admission sent ice down her spine. "Watching me? Did you truly think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't keep track of where you went, who you spoke to, how your life unfolded after you rejected me?" He paused, and something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been pain or anger or both. "I watched you refuse 2 other offers of marriage in the years that followed. I watched your father die and leave you with barely enough to survive. I watched you become the object of pity and mockery, the spinster aunt, the cautionary tale. Why?" The word burst from her before she could stop it. "Why would you do such a thing?" "Because," he said quietly, "you were the only woman who ever said no to me. The only person in my entire life who looked at everything I could offer, title, wealth, position, and found it wanting. Do you have any idea what that does to a man like me? Lavinia found herself unable to look away from him. This close, she could see the lines that 20 years had carved into his face, the coldness that seemed to emanate from him like winter frost. But beneath it, she could also see something else, something that looked almost like hunger. "It wasn't you I found wanting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was myself. I was 20 years old and terrified. You were a duke. I would have been crushed under the weight of that life. So instead, you chose this?" His gesture took in the ballroom behind them, the whispers, the mockery, the loneliness. "You chose poverty and ridicule rather than take a chance on me." "I chose freedom," she said, and felt a flash of her old fire. Such as it was. Better to be poor and myself than rich and performing a role I could never fill. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took her gloved hand in his. Lavinia's breath caught. She should pull away. This was improper. Dangerous. She didn't move. "I am 38 years old, Lavinia." The use of her Christian name sent a shock through her. "I have spent 20 years building my fortune, consolidating my power, crushing anyone who dared to challenge me. I have made myself into the coldest, most feared man in England. And do you know why?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "Because I was determined that when I came back to you, and I always knew I would come back to you, you would have no reason to refuse me, no excuse that I couldn't counter, no fear that I couldn't address." His grip on her hand tightened. "You were afraid of being crushed by my world? I have spent 2 decades ensuring that my world is so secure, so unassailable, that nothing and no one could ever touch you. You thought yourself unworthy of being a duchess? I have eliminated every rival, every critic, every voice that might dare to judge you." "That's insane," Lavinia breathed. "Perhaps." His smile was cold and sharp as a blade. "But it's also the truth. I have waited 20 years for you, Lavinia. I have remained unmarried while every matchmaking mother in England threw their daughters at me. I have endured the gossip and the speculation and the rumors that I prefer men, or that I'm incapable, or that I'm simply too cold to feel desire." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "I let them think all of those things, because the truth, that I was waiting for one stubborn, brilliant woman to finally see what I've always known. That truth was mine alone." Lavinia felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. This couldn't be real. This had to be some fever dream brought on by too many years of loneliness and regret. "Why now?" she managed to ask. "Why tonight, after all this time?" "Because I'm tired of waiting. Because watching you stand alone in that ballroom, listening to those petty, small-minded women mock you for having the courage to refuse what they would have killed for. It made me realize that if I waited any longer, I would lose what little patience I have left." His other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I have waited 20 years for you to be ready, to see me not as a terrifying prospect but as a man who has never wanted anyone else. Who will never want anyone else." "This is madness," she whispered, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "Yes," he agreed, "it is, but it's also the only truth I have." For 20 years, Lavinia had convinced herself that she had made the right choice, that refusing Cassian Thorne had been an act of self-preservation, of protecting herself from a life that would have destroyed her. But standing here on this rain-misted terrace, with his hand on her face and his eyes burning into hers, she realized something that made her breath catch and her heart race. She had been lying to herself. She hadn't refused him because she was afraid of his world. She had refused him because she was afraid of how much she wanted him. And that fear had cost her 20 years. Before she could stop herself, before she could think about propriety or consequences or anything beyond this moment, she spoke the words that had been locked inside her for 2 decades. "I've thought about you every day since that night in the garden." His expression didn't change, but she felt the tremor that ran through his hand where it touched her face. "I walked away from you and told myself I'd done the right thing," she continued, her voice gaining strength. I watched you from a distance and convinced myself I felt nothing. I let them call me a spinster and a cautionary tale and told myself I preferred this loneliness to the alternative. But I was lying. To them and to myself. She reached up and covered his hand with her own. I have regretted that night in the garden every single day for 20 years. Lavinia. But I'm 40 years old now, Cassian. Not 20. I'm not afraid anymore. Or rather. She smiled and felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. I'm terrified, but I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions for me. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he released her and took a step back. Lavinia's heart sank. She had waited too long. He dropped to one knee. Right there on the rain-dampened terrace, with the light from the ballroom windows casting gold across his dark hair and severe face, the Duke of Redmoor knelt before her. From inside, there were gasps. The music had stopped. People were crowding at the windows, staring in shock. Cassian didn't look at them. His eyes never left Lavinia's face. 20 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. I asked you to marry me. You refused, and I accepted your decision. But I never stopped wanting you. I never stopped waiting for you. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. I bought this ring the day after you refused me. I have carried it with me every day since, waiting for the moment when I could ask you again. He opened the box. Inside was a ring of simple, stunning beauty. A single deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds, set in gold that had been worn smooth by 20 years of being carried close to his heart. Lavinia Hartwell, he said quietly, will you marry me? Not because you're afraid or because you think you should or because society demands it, but because you want me as much as I have always wanted you. Lavinia looked down at him. This cold, feared, powerful man kneeling before her on a wet terrace while half of London society watched in stunned silence. And she realized that she was done being afraid. Yes, she said clearly. Yes, I will marry you. The whispers exploded like fireworks, but Lavinia barely heard them. Because Cassian was standing, and he was sliding the ring onto her finger, and he was pulling her into his arms with a fierce, desperate intensity that took her breath away. I've waited 20 years to hear you say that, he said against her hair. You're mine now, Lavinia, and I promise you, anyone who ever mocked you, anyone who ever made you feel less than you are, will regret it. She should probably have been disturbed by the dark promise in his voice. Instead, she felt something fierce and hot unfurl in her chest. Revenge, she realized, wasn't just his. It was theirs. And it was only beginning. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through London society that reverberated for weeks. The Duke of Redmoor, after 20 years of resolute bachelorhood, was to marry Lavinia Hartwell, a woman of 40 with no fortune, no particular beauty, and no social standing beyond her connection to minor gentry. The gossip was vicious and immediate. She must have trapped him somehow. Perhaps she has some hold over him, some secret she's threatening to reveal. 40 years old, past childbearing age certainly. What could he possibly want with her? It must be a business arrangement of some kind. There can be no other explanation. Lavinia heard all of it. It was impossible not to, when the whispers followed her everywhere she went. But for the first time in her life, the mockery didn't touch her. Because every evening, Cassian came to call at her modest townhouse, and every evening he made it abundantly clear that this was no business arrangement. Let them talk, he said one evening, as they sat in her small drawing room under the watchful eye of her elderly maid, Mrs. Dawson. The proprieties still had to be observed, even for an engaged couple. Their opinions mean nothing. They say I've trapped you, Lavinia said quietly, her fingers tracing the pattern on her teacup, that there must be some explanation beyond the obvious one. And what is the obvious one? She looked up at him. He was sitting across from her in a chair that was too small for his frame, looking utterly out of place in her shabby genteel surroundings. But his eyes on her were intense, focused, as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. That you want me, she said. Yes. No hesitation. No equivocation. I want you. I have always wanted you. And now, finally, you're going to be mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have alarmed her. Instead, it sent heat curling through her belly. But there was something else there too. Something she needed to understand. Cassian, she said slowly. When you said you've been watching me all these years, what exactly did you mean? He was quiet for a moment. His long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Mrs. Dawson dozed in the corner, her knitting abandoned in her lap. I meant, he said finally, that I have kept myself informed of your circumstances, where you lived, how you were managing financially, who called on you, whether you were, he paused, whether you were happy. That's, she searched for the word. Obsessive. Yes. The blunt admission startled her. You don't deny it? Why would I? It's the truth. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. After you refused me, I told myself I would move on, find someone else. Any rational man would have done so, but I found I couldn't. Every woman I met, I compared to you. Every conversation felt hollow because it wasn't with you. So yes, I watched you. I made sure you were safe, that you had enough to live on. Wait. Lavinia's teacup clattered against its saucer. What do you mean, you made sure I had enough to live on? Cassian's expression didn't change. Your father's estate was heavily encumbered when he died. The debts would have consumed everything, leaving you destitute. I purchased the debts through an intermediary and forgave them. The small independence you've been living on for the past 7 years? That was what remained after the debts were cleared. Lavinia stared at him, her mind reeling. You paid my father's debts? Without telling me? Would you have accepted if I had told you? No, of course not. Precisely. He said it as if this justified everything. You needed help. I was in a position to provide it. The fact that you didn't know it came from me was irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. She stood abruptly, her hands clenched at her sides. Cassian, that's controlling. Manipulative. Yes, he agreed calmly. It is, but it kept you safe. It ensured that you had food and shelter, and didn't have to throw yourself on the mercy of relatives who pitied you. His eyes met hers steadily. Would you rather I had done nothing? Watched you sink into poverty and degradation because my pride demanded that you know where the help came from. Lavinia opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. He was right, damn him. If she had known the money came from him, she would have refused it. Would have chosen destitution over accepting charity from the man she'd rejected. And that stubborn pride would have destroyed her. This is what you meant, she said slowly, when you said you spent 20 years making your world secure enough that nothing could touch me. Partially. I also meant... He stood and crossed to her, his hands settling on her shoulders. In 1835, when I asked you to marry me, I was 22 years old. Newly come into my title, yes, but still finding my footing. I had wealth and position, but I hadn't yet consolidated my power. You were right to be afraid, Lavinia. My enemies could have hurt you. Society could have crushed you. I wasn't strong enough then to protect you from all of it. His hands tightened on her shoulders. But I am now. I have spent the last 20 years systematically eliminating anyone who might pose a threat to me or mine. My fortune is so vast that no financial crisis could touch it. My political influence extends to the highest levels of government. My social position is unassailable. And anyone who even thinks about speaking against you will find themselves ruined so thoroughly that their grandchildren will still be paying the price. He said it matter-of-factly, as if describing the weather. Lavinia's mouth went dry. That's terrifying. Yes, he said softly. I am terrifying. I have made myself into a monster to keep you safe. But I need you to understand something, Lavinia. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. I will never use that power against you. You are the only person in this world who is completely safe from me. But everyone else? Everyone who has ever mocked you, pitted you, looked down on you? They are not safe. and they're about to learn what it means to have made an enemy of the future Duchess of Redmoor. Lavinia should have been horrified. She should have been pulling away, reconsidering this entire engagement. Instead, she felt a dark thrill race down her spine. "What are you planning?" she heard herself ask. His smile was cold and sharp. "You'll see. But first, there are some legal and financial matters we need to discuss." Over the next few weeks, Lavinia received an education in just how marriages worked among the aristocracy, and how much power a duke could wield when he chose to. The marriage settlement negotiations were handled by Cassian's solicitors, stern men in dark coats who treated Lavinia with a deference that was both flattering and unsettling. Under normal circumstances, a bride's family would negotiate on her behalf, ensuring she had some financial protection and independence within the marriage. Lavinia had no family in a position to negotiate. Her brother was a country vicar with 4 children and barely enough income to support them. He had written her a letter of congratulations on her engagement that was so transparently relieved. She would no longer be a financial burden, that it had made her laugh bitterly. But Cassian's solicitors explained that His Grace had very particular ideas about the settlement. "The Duke wishes to settle upon you an annual income of £5,000. The lead solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, told her. "This will be yours to control entirely, with no oversight from His Grace. In addition, the townhouse in Mayfair that is currently being prepared for your use will be deeded to you personally, not held in trust." Lavinia's hand trembled as she set down her teacup. £5,000? That's more than most men of the gentry live on in a year. His Grace was quite insistent. "He wishes you to have complete financial independence." "But why? We'll be married. What's his will be mine anyway, in the eyes of the law." Even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Under the doctrine of coverture that governed English marriage law, a woman's property became her husband's upon marriage. She would have no legal right to anything, unless her husband chose to give it to her. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat delicately. His Grace's exact words were, "I want her to know she's choosing to stay with me, not because she has no other option, but because she wants to. The settlement is structured so that even if you were to leave the marriage, you would retain your income and property." Lavinia felt her throat tighten. "He's giving me the power to leave him? More accurately, he's ensuring you never have to stay out of financial necessity." Later, when she confronted Cassian about it, he was unapologetic. "You refused me once because you were afraid," he said. "I won't have you staying with me for the same reason. If you're going to be my wife, it will be because you choose it. Every day. Most men would want their wives dependent on them. I'm not most men." His eyes were fierce. "I want you, Lavinia. All of you. Your brilliance, your stubbornness, your sharp tongue and sharper mind. But I want you to choose me. Not because society demands it. Not because you have no alternative. But because you want me as much as I want you." It was the most romantic and the most terrifying thing anyone had ever said to her. The engagement period, by necessity, was short. At their age, and given Lavinia's lack of family connections, there was no need for the elaborate courtship rituals that governed younger couples. 6 weeks from the night on the terrace to the wedding day. 6 weeks for society to gossip and speculate and spread increasingly wild rumors. 6 weeks for Lavinia to see exactly what Cassian had meant about revenge. It started with Lady Pemberton, the woman who had sneered about Lavinia being quaint, for still attending balls at 40 found herself suddenly unable to secure vouchers for Almack's. Her daughter's engagement to a baronet was mysteriously broken off. Her husband's application for a government position was rejected without explanation. Within a fortnight, Lady Pemberton was a social pariah, though no one could quite say why. "Did you do that?" Lavinia asked Cassian one evening. Lady Pemberton's husband was embezzling from the charitable trust he administered. "I simply made sure the right people learned about it." His tone was casual. "He'll likely face criminal charges, and his wife and daughter will suffer for his crimes." His wife knew about the embezzlement and said nothing, and his daughter has spent 3 seasons spreading vicious gossip about women who competed with her for male attention. They're reaping what they've sown. He said it without heat, without apparent emotion, just stating facts. Mrs. Ashford, who had tittered about Lavinia having the dignity to retire to the country, found her own situation suddenly reversed. Her son, who had been courting the daughter of a wealthy industrialist, was cut off without explanation. The industrialist's daughter married someone else within a month. Mr. Ashford's business ventures, previously prosperous, began to fail. Contracts were cancelled. Loans were called in. Lavinia watched it happen with a mixture of horror and fascination. "You're destroying them," she said to Cassian. "No, I'm removing my protection. There's a difference." He poured himself a brandy in her small drawing room. He spent every evening here now, propriety be damned. Men like Ashford survive because men like me tolerate them. I've simply stopped tolerating them. If they fail, it's because they were always on shaky ground. That's sophistry, perhaps, but it's also effective. She should have been appalled. She should have demanded he stop. But a dark part of her, the part that had endured 20 years of mockery and pity, felt a savage satisfaction watching the people who had tormented her face consequences for the first time in their privileged lives. "I'm a terrible person," she said quietly. Cassian crossed to her and tilted her chin up with one finger. "No, you're a person who was hurt, repeatedly, by people who should have shown you kindness. Wanting them to face justice for that doesn't make you terrible. It makes you human. Is that what this is? Justice?" "Yes." No hesitation. They built their social standing on the backs of people they considered beneath them. They maintained their positions by making others feel small. That's not just unkind, Lavinia. It's a form of tyranny, and tyrants should always face consequences. His conviction was absolute, and God help her, she found herself agreeing with him. But the revenge wasn't all external. 3 weeks before the wedding, Lavinia's sister-in-law, Margaret, came to call. Margaret had married Lavinia's brother Thomas 15 years ago, and had spent the intervening years making it clear that she considered Lavinia a burden and an embarrassment to the family. Every interaction had been laced with condescension. Every conversation a reminder that Lavinia was dependent on their occasional charity. Now Margaret sat in Lavinia's drawing room, soon to be her former drawing room, as she would be moving to Cassian's Mayfair house after the wedding, and smiled with an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Dear Lavinia, I'm so pleased for you. We all are. Are you?" Lavinia kept her voice pleasant. "Of course. It's such a relief. I mean such a joy, to see you settled at last. And with a duke. Who could have imagined?" "Certainly not you," Lavinia said dryly. Margaret's smile faltered. "Yes, well, I wanted to speak with you about the wedding arrangements. Naturally, as your family, we'll want to play a prominent role." "Naturally," Lavinia interrupted. "As my family, you would have been consulted about the arrangements. If I had felt particularly close to you." Margaret blinked. "I don't understand." "Don't you?" Lavinia set down her teacup with a precise click. "For 15 years, Margaret, you have made it abundantly clear that you consider me an obligation, a burden to be endured. You have never invited me to stay with you for more than a few days. You have never included me in family celebrations unless you absolutely had to. When I came to you after Father died, asking if you might have room for me, you told me it would be impossible and suggested I seek a position as a governess." Margaret's face flushed. "We have 4 children, Lavinia. We couldn't afford. And yet somehow you afforded a new carriage last year, and a trip to Bath, and a new wardrobe for your daughters come out." Lavinia's voice was calm, almost pleasant. "I'm not angry about it, Margaret. You made your priorities clear. I simply want you to understand that you don't get to claim closeness now, when it's socially advantageous to do so. That's not fair, isn't it?" Lavinia stood. "You will be invited to the wedding, of course. You're Thomas's wife and he is my brother. But you will not be seated in a position of prominence. You will not be acknowledged as having played any role in my upbringing or support. And you will not be welcomed into my new life beyond the bare minimum that courtesy demands." Margaret stood as well, her face mottled with anger and humiliation. "You've changed, Lavinia. This duke of yours has made you cruel." "No," Lavinia said quietly. "He's made me able to afford cruelty. There's a difference." After Margaret left in a fury, Cassian emerged from the study where he'd been ostensibly reviewing papers. "You heard all that," Lavinia said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. And I'm proud of you." He crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. "You stood up for yourself. You set boundaries. You refused to let someone who hurt you claim credit for your success." Lavinia leaned into his chest, breathing in his scent. Soap and tobacco and something uniquely him. "I feel terrible." "That's because you're kind. But kindness doesn't mean letting people walk over you. Is this what our marriage will be like? Revenge and power plays and cutting people out of our lives?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he tilted her face up to his. "Our marriage will be whatever we make it," he said. "But yes, it will include setting boundaries, protecting ourselves, refusing to tolerate people who mean us harm." His thumb brushed across her lower lip. "The world can be cruel, Lavinia. Especially to people like us. People who don't quite fit the mold, who refuse to perform the expected roles. We can either let that cruelty break us, or we can build walls high enough and strong enough that it can't touch us. I prefer the latter." "That sounds lonely." "It would be if we were alone. But we're not. We have each other." And when he kissed her, properly kissed her for the first time with Mrs. Dawson conveniently absent, Lavinia felt the walls he'd built around himself begin to crack. Not to let the world in, but to let her in. The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of fittings and arrangements and social obligations. Lavinia found herself thrust into a world she'd only ever observed from the edges. The world of the highest echelons of society, where dukes and duchesses moved with absolute confidence and everyone else scrambled to please them. It was, she discovered, both exhilarating and exhausting. The wedding dress alone required 6 fittings. It was made of ivory silk so fine it seemed to shimmer in the light, with lace that had been imported from Brussels and seed pearls sewn into intricate patterns. It was the most beautiful thing Lavinia had ever worn. It was also a statement. "His Grace wants everyone to see that you're not some poor relation he's taken pity on," the modiste explained as she pinned the hem. "You're to look every inch a duchess." And she did. When Lavinia finally saw herself in the full ensemble, the dress, the veil, the Redmoor diamonds that Cassian had insisted she wear, she barely recognized herself. She looked powerful, untouchable. She looked like someone who could stand beside the Duke of Redmoor and not be diminished. 2 days before the wedding, Cassian took her to see Redmoor Hell. They traveled by his private coach, a luxurious vehicle with velvet seats and windows that let in the weak winter sunlight. The journey took 4 hours, winding through the countryside until they reached the estate. Lavinia had heard descriptions of Redmoor Hall, of course. Everyone had. It was one of the great houses of England, a sprawling Palladian mansion set in hundreds of acres of parkland. But descriptions hadn't prepared her for the reality. The house rose before them like a small palace, honey-colored stone glowing in the afternoon light. 3 stories with more windows than she could count, and wings that stretched out on either side of the central building. The drive curved through manicured lawns and ancient oak trees, and in the distance she could see glass houses and stables and what looked like a small lake. This is... She couldn't find the words. "Overwhelming," Cassian suggested. "Yes," he took her hand. "It's just a house, Lavinia. Stone and mortar and a great many rooms that no one ever uses. It's a symbol of everything you are, everything I'm about to become." "No." His grip tightened. "It's a place. You're about to become my wife. That's the only thing that matters." The staff was lined up to greet them. Dozens of servants in immaculate livery, from the butler and housekeeper down to the lowest scullery maid. They bowed and curtsied as Lavinia passed, and she felt the weight of their expectations. These people would be looking to her to manage this vast household, to host dinners and balls, to produce an heir. The panic must have shown on her face, because Cassian leaned down and whispered in her ear, Mrs. Barrett has been running this house for 30 years. She doesn't need you to tell her how to do her job. All you need to do is be yourself. The housekeeper, a formidable woman with iron-gray hair, stepped forward. Welcome to Redmoor Hall, Miss Hartwell. We're all very pleased that His Grace is finally bringing home a Duchess. There was warmth in her voice. Genuine welcome. Lavinia felt some of the panic recede. Cassian showed her through the house himself. The grand staterooms that were used only for formal occasions, the more intimate family rooms, the library that made her gasp with delight, 3 stories of books with a spiral staircase and ladders on rails, and finally the ducal apartments. These will be yours, he said, opening the door to a suite of rooms that overlooked the gardens. Bedroom, sitting room, dressing room. You can change anything you don't like. The rooms were beautiful but impersonal, decorated in shades of cream and gold, elegant but cold. I'll want to add some color, Lavinia said. Some books. Some life, Cassian finished. Yes, please. This house has been a mausoleum for too long. She turned to look at him. He was standing by the window, silhouetted against the winter light, and for a moment she saw past the cold exterior to the loneliness beneath. You've been alone here, she said softly, for 20 years. Rattling around in this vast pile of stone, wondering if I was a fool for waiting. He looked at her. I'm not alone anymore. Lavinia crossed to him and took his hand. No, you're not. Are you afraid? He asked. Of this life? Of what you're about to step into? Terrified, she admitted. But I'm done letting fear make my choices for me. Good. He pulled her close, his arms coming around her with a fierce possessiveness that made her breath catch. Because in 2 days you're going to be mine. Legally, socially, in every way that matters. And I promise you, Lavinia, no one will ever make you feel small again. Standing there in her future bedroom, wrapped in the arms of the most feared man in England, Lavinia realized something. She didn't need him to make her feel powerful. She already was powerful. She always had been. But having him beside her, having someone who saw her strength and refused to be threatened by it, that was what she'd been waiting for all along. The wedding took place on a cold December morning at St. George's, Hanover Square. Lavinia woke in her small townhouse for the last time, her stomach a knot of nerves and anticipation. Mrs. Dawson helped her dress, tears streaming down the old woman's face. I never thought I'd see this day, miss, she said as she fastened the last of the buttons. After all these years. Neither did I, Lavinia admitted. The Redmoor diamonds felt heavy around her throat, a massive necklace of sapphires and diamonds that matched her engagement ring, a physical manifestation of the weight she was about to take on. The church was packed. Cassian had invited everyone, not just family and close friends, but all of society. Every person who had ever mocked Lavinia, every woman who had pitied her, every man who had overlooked her. They were all there to witness her triumph, or her doom. She suspected some of them weren't sure which it would be. Her brother Thomas walked her down the aisle. He was nervous, sweating despite the cold, awed by the grandeur surrounding them. Margaret sat in the pews looking sour, but Lavinia barely noticed them, because Cassian was standing at the altar, tall and severe in his black morning coat, and his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. When she reached him, he took her hand and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers. He was nervous too, she realized. This cold, feared, powerful man was nervous about marrying her. The realization steadied her. The ceremony was traditional, the words ancient and binding. Lavinia heard herself making vows to love, honor, and obey, and wondered if she meant the last one. Probably not. And from the slight curve of Cassian's mouth, he knew it too and didn't care. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Cassian kissed her with a possessiveness that probably scandalized half the congregation. Lavinia kissed him back. They were married. She was the Duchess of Redmoor, and the revenge was about to become very, very real. The wedding breakfast was held at Cassian's Mayfair house, the house that would now be Lavinia's home when they were in London. It was every bit as grand as Redmoor Hall, a massive townhouse in the most fashionable part of the city, with ballrooms and drawing rooms and enough bedrooms to house a small army. The breakfast itself was an elaborate affair, courses upon courses of delicacies, champagne flowing freely, an orchestra playing in the corner. All of society had been invited, and they came because one did not refuse an invitation from the Duke of Redmoor. Lavinia stood beside her new husband in the receiving line, greeting guests with a composure she didn't entirely feel. Lady Pemberton came through, her face tight. "Your Grace," she said to Cassian, then turned to Lavinia with visible effort. "Your Grace." It was the first time anyone had called her that. "Lady Pemberton," Lavinia said pleasantly. "How kind of you to attend." The woman's eyes flashed with something that might have been hatred. Then she moved on. "She blames you for her husband's disgrace," Cassian murmured. "Should I feel guilty? He committed the crimes. You simply ensured he faced justice." More guests filed past. The Ashfords, both looking diminished. A dozen other families who had patronized Lavinia over the years, all now forced to show her deference. And then Rosalind appeared, radiant and genuinely happy. "Aunt Lavinia, you look absolutely beautiful." She embraced Lavinia with enthusiasm. "I'm so happy for you." "Thank you, darling." Lavinia felt tears prick her eyes. At least someone in her family was glad for her without reservation. After the receiving line, there were toasts. Long, elaborate toasts from men of importance, all of them subtly positioning themselves in relation to the new Duchess of Redmoor. Lavinia barely listened. She was watching the room, seeing the dynamics play out. The young women who had once pitted her now looked at her with envy. The matrons who had mocked her now scrambled for her attention. The men who had overlooked her now sought introductions. It was intoxicating and slightly nauseating. "You look like you're about to bolt," Cassian said quietly beside her. "I'm considering it." "Don't. We're not done yet." "Not done with what?" "Showing them exactly who you are." He stood then, cutting through the chatter with his mere presence. The room fell silent. "I want to thank you all for attending today," Cassian said, his voice carrying easily through the space. "It's not every day that a man has the opportunity to marry the woman he's loved for 20 years. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the usual type of wedding speech. 20 years ago, Cassian continued, I asked Lavinia Hartwell to marry me. She refused, and I spent the next 2 decades becoming the man she deserved. He looked at Lavinia, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. My wife is the most intelligent, most courageous, most remarkable woman I have ever known. She could have married any number of men over the years, men who would have been lucky to have her. But she chose to wait, to refuse offers that didn't match what she knew she was worth. And society mocked her for it. The room had gone deathly quiet. You called her a spinster, cautionary tale. You pitted her, or worse, you looked down on her. And all the while, she maintained her dignity, her grace, and her self-respect. His voice hardened. That took more courage than any of you will ever possess. Someone coughed nervously. No one else moved. So let me be very clear, Cassian said. Lavinia is now the Duchess of Redmoor. She will be treated with the respect that position demands. Anyone who fails to show her that respect will answer to me. And I promise you, you do not want to answer to me. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. He raised his glass. To my Duchess, the woman I waited 20 years for, the only woman I will ever love. To the Duchess, the room echoed, because they had no choice. Lavinia felt tears streaming down her face. She didn't care. Cassian sat down beside her and took her hand under the table. That was, she started. True, he finished. Every word. The guests left eventually, filing out with expressions ranging from thoughtful to troubled. The party was over, but the real conversation was about to begin. Cassian led Lavinia to his study, their study now, she supposed. It was a masculine room, all dark wood and leather, with a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. He poured them both brandy, despite the early hour. "We need to talk," he said. Lavinia's stomach tightened. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, just honest." He handed her a glass and sat across from her. "I promised you transparency. So here it is. I'm not an easy man to live with." "I gathered that. I'm controlling. I'm possessive. I have very specific ideas about how things should be done, and I don't tolerate incompetence or disloyalty." He paused. "The servants here and at Redmoor are terrified of me." "I know. But I need you to understand. I will never use that coldness against you. You're exempt from it. Entirely." Lavinia sipped her brandy, feeling the burn. "What if I disagree with you? What if I want to do something you don't approve of? Then we'll argue about it. And you'll probably win, because I'm constitutionally incapable of denying you anything you really want." He smiled slightly. "That's what happens when you spend 20 years obsessed with someone." "Cassian." She set down her glass and leaned forward. "I need to know, this obsession of yours, is it healthy? Is it something I should be worried about?" "Yes," he said bluntly. "It's not healthy. It's not normal. A rational man doesn't spend 20 years fixated on one woman who refused him. A rational man moves on. But you didn't." "No, because from the moment I met you, everyone else felt like a pale imitation. I tried, Lavinia. I tried to be interested in other women. I tried to imagine a life without you, but I couldn't. You got under my skin, into my blood, and I've never been able to get you out." He stood and crossed to her, kneeling in front of her chair just as he had on the terrace all those weeks ago. "So yes, you should probably be worried, because I love you with an intensity that borders on madness. Because I would burn down the world for you. Because anyone who hurts you will wish they'd never been born." He took her hands. "But I promise you this. That intensity will never be turned against you. You are the only safe place in my world. The only person who doesn't have to fear me." Lavinia looked down at him. This powerful, dangerous man kneeling at her feet, and felt something shift in her chest. "I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. "I should be. God knows everyone else is. But I'm not." "Why not?" "Because I see what no one else sees. The loneliness behind the coldness. The vulnerability behind the power. The man who's been waiting 20 years for someone to choose him." "Lavinia, I love you," she said, and watched his eyes widen. "I think I've loved you since that night in the garden, when you asked me to marry you and I was too afraid to say yes. I've spent 20 years trying to convince myself I didn't, that I made the right choice refusing you. But I was lying to myself." He surged up and kissed her, fierce and desperate and possessive. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to be a disaster together," he said. "Probably. Two obsessive, stubborn, slightly mad people who can't let go of the past." "Sounds accurate. I wouldn't have it any other way." Neither would she. That night, in the ducal bedroom that was now hers, Lavinia stood before the mirror while her new ladies' maid helped her undress. The girl was young, nervous, clearly awed by her new mistress. "You can go," Lavinia said gently. "I can manage the rest myself." "Are you certain, Your Grace? It's my job to." "I'm certain. Go get some rest." The girl curtsied and fled, clearly relieved. Lavinia finished undressing herself, trading the elaborate wedding gown for a nightdress of fine white linen and lace. She brushed out her hair and studied herself in the mirror. She looked the same, but everything had changed. She was a duchess now, one of the most powerful women in England, at least in terms of social rank. She had wealth, position, influence, and a husband who loved her with a frightening intensity. The door between her bedroom and Cassian's opened. He stood in the doorway, wearing a dressing gown, his dark hair slightly disheveled. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," Lavinia said. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might give me time. We've been married less than 12 hours. I've waited 20 years for you." He crossed the room slowly. "I'm done waiting." Her heart began to pound. Cassian, if you want me to leave, I will. He stopped a few feet away. I promised you choice, Lavinia. Always choice. If you're not ready, if you need time, I'll give you that. But I need you to know. I want you. I've wanted you since I was 22 years old, and that hasn't diminished. It's only grown stronger. Lavinia thought about all the years she'd spent alone. All the nights she'd lain in her narrow bed in her shabby townhouse, wondering what her life might have been if she'd been brave enough to say yes all those years ago. She was done wondering. Stay, she said. The relief in his eyes was almost painful to see. He closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands. I love you, he said. I don't know if I've said that enough, but I do. More than anything. I love you too. This time, when he kissed her, there was no desperation. Only certainty. They had both made their choice, and they were choosing each other. 3 months later, spring came to Redmoor Hall. Lavinia stood in the gardens, watching the first daffodils push through the soil. The air was warmer now, carrying the scent of growing things and new beginnings. She'd settled into her role more easily than she'd expected. Mrs. Barrett had indeed been running the household efficiently for decades and needed minimal oversight. The servants, who had been terrified of Cassian, seemed to relax somewhat around Lavinia, though they still maintained perfect deference. And Cassian was exactly as advertised. Controlling, possessive, utterly devoted. He had kept his promise about not using his coldness against her. With her, he was warm, attentive, almost vulnerable. With the rest of the world, he remained the feared Duke of Redmoor. The revenge continued too. Quietly, systematically, everyone who had ever mocked or slighted Lavinia found their circumstances diminishing. Not destroyed, Cassian was too clever for that, but definitely reduced. Lady Pemberton's family had left London entirely, relocating to a modest estate in Yorkshire. The Ashfords had been forced to sell their townhouse and significantly reduce their staff. A dozen other families found themselves on the outside of society's inner circle, invited to fewer events, given less credit, slowly fading from prominence. And through it all, Cassian maintained his innocence. He was simply making business decisions, calling in loans, withdrawing patronage. Nothing personal. It was absolutely personal. But Lavinia found she couldn't bring herself to protest. These people had made her life miserable for 20 years. If they faced consequences for that, well, perhaps they should have thought of that before they decided cruelty was an acceptable form of entertainment. There you are. She turned to find Cassian walking across the lawn toward her. He'd been in his study all morning, dealing with estate business and correspondence. I needed some air, she said. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Are you happy? It was a question he asked often, as if he still couldn't quite believe this was real. Yes, she said, and meant it. I'm happy. No regrets. Only that I didn't say yes 20 years ago. If you had, we would have been different people. We might not have worked. You think we work now? Don't you? Lavinia leaned back against him, feeling his warmth, his solidity. Yes, we work. We're probably slightly insane, but we work. I'll take slightly insane over alone any day. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the spring flowers bloom. I had a letter from Rosalind this morning, Lavinia said. She's asking if she can visit next month. Of course, I like your niece. She's one of the few members of your family who isn't insufferable. Cassian, it's true. You can't just say things like that. Why not? It's my house. I'll say what I like. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Besides, you were thinking the same thing. She was, but still. Margaret is furious with me, Lavinia said. She sent a very pointed letter about how I've changed, how power has corrupted me, how I've forgotten where I came from. What did you say in response? I haven't responded. I'm not sure I will. Good. His arms tightened around her. You don't owe her anything. Not explanations, not apologies, not even the courtesy of a response. Is this what we are now? people who cut others out of our lives without a second thought. We're people who protect ourselves and each other. If that means limiting contact with people who bring us nothing but pain, then yes. He turned her in his arms so she was facing him. You spent 20 years being kind to people who were cruel to you. You spent 20 years giving people the benefit of the doubt. And where did it get you? Here. Alone and mocked and miserable. Until me, he agreed. And now you're not alone. And anyone who mocks you answers to me. And you're not miserable. Are you? No, she said softly. I'm not miserable. Then stop feeling guilty about it. You deserve happiness, Lavinia. You deserve respect. You deserve a life where you don't have to constantly prove your worth to people who will never appreciate you anyway. He was right. She knew he was right. But old habits died hard. I still think about that night in the garden sometimes, she said. When I refused you, I wonder what you thought of me. I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever met. She blinked. What? You said no to a duke. You refused wealth and position and security because you knew you weren't ready. That takes courage most people don't have. He brushed a strand of hair back from her face. I was hurt, yes, and angry, but mostly I was impressed. You were the first person in my life who wasn't afraid to disappoint me. I was terrified, but you did it anyway. That's what courage is. Lavinia looked up at him. This man who had waited 20 years for her, who had built an empire and toppled enemies, and maintained his obsessive devotion through 2 decades of loneliness. I don't deserve you, she said. Yes, you do. And I don't deserve you. That's why we're perfect for each other. He kissed her then, there in the garden with the spring flowers blooming around them and the warm sun on their faces. And Lavinia realized something. Revenge wasn't the point. It had never been the point. The point was this. 2 people who had been alone for too long finding each other. 2 people who had been hurt and isolated and misunderstood finally being seen. The revenge was just insurance. A way of ensuring that nothing and no one could take this away from them. She could live with that. When they broke apart, Cassian smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine. The kind he only ever showed her. Come inside, he said. I want to show you something. What? You'll see. He led her back to the house, through the grand entrance hall and up the sweeping staircase to the 2nd floor. But instead of turning toward their private apartments, he led her down a different corridor to a door she'd never paid much attention to. He opened it. Inside was a library, not as grand as the main library downstairs, but more intimate, smaller. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but unlike the main library's ancient tomes, these were newer volumes, novels, poetry, philosophy, science. There was a fireplace with comfortable chairs arranged before it, a writing desk by the window, fresh flowers on the mantel. What is this? Lavinia breathed. Your library, your private study, a place that's yours alone. He watched her face carefully. I know you've been using the morning room for your correspondence and reading, but I thought you might like a space that was truly your own. Somewhere you could retreat when the Duchess business becomes overwhelming. Lavinia walked slowly into the room, trailing her fingers along the spines of books. You did this for me? I had it prepared while we were in London for the season. Mrs. Barrett oversaw the decorating based on my instructions. If you don't like it, we can change anything. She turned and kissed him, cutting off his words. It's perfect, she said against his lips. You're perfect. I'm really not. You're perfect for me. That's all that matters. They stayed in her new library for the rest of the afternoon, her reading in one of the comfortable chairs while he dealt with correspondence at the writing desk. Not talking, just being together. This, Lavinia thought, was what marriage was supposed to be. Not grand gestures or social performances. Just 2 people choosing to share their lives. To share their space and their silence and their joy. All the revenge in the world couldn't compare to this. That evening, over dinner, Cassian mentioned that he'd received an invitation. The Queen is hosting a reception next month. We're invited. Lavinia set down her fork carefully. The Queen. Yes, apparently she wants to meet the new Duchess of Redmoor. There's been so much gossip about our marriage that her curiosity has been piqued. What kind of gossip? The usual. That you trapped me. That there's some secret reason for our marriage. That I've gone mad in my old age. He said it with amusement. Queen Victoria tends to have sympathy for unconventional matches, given her own devotion to Albert. I think she wants to see for herself whether ours is a love match or a business arrangement. And what will we tell her? The truth. That I waited 20 years for the only woman I've ever loved. And she finally said yes. Lavinia felt warmth spread through her chest. You make it sound romantic. It is romantic. It's also obsessive and slightly unhinged. But romance and madness have always been closely related. She laughed. Fair point. Will you be nervous? Meeting the Queen. Terrified. But I've spent the last 3 months learning to be a duchess. I think I can manage a royal reception. You're already better at being a duchess than half the women who were born to the role. That's a low bar. Perhaps. But it's true nonetheless. After dinner, they retired to the drawing room. It was a habit they'd fallen into, spending the evening together, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Tonight, Cassian seemed thoughtful. What are you thinking about? Lavinia asked. The future. What about it? We've spent so much time dealing with the past. Our history, your revenge, settling scores with people who wronged you. But I've been thinking we should start looking forward instead. What did you have in mind? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to do something meaningful with the duchy. Something beyond just managing estates and accumulating wealth. Like what? There are families on my lands who are struggling. Tenant farmers who can barely make ends meet. Children who have no access to education. He leaned forward, his expression intense. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What's the point of it if I don't use it for something beyond my own comfort? Lavinia felt her heart swell. You want to help them. I want us to help them. Together. He reached for her hand. You're intelligent, compassionate, and you understand what it's like to struggle. You could oversee programs for education, for supporting widows and spinsters who have no family to care for them. You could make a real difference. You've been thinking about this for a while, haven't you? Since the wedding. Watching you navigate society, seeing how you handle the Duchess role with such grace, it made me realize that we could do more. Be more. Not just to each other, but to the people who depend on us. This was a side of Cassian she'd suspected existed but had never seen so clearly. Beneath the cold exterior, beneath the ruthless businessman and feared duke, was a man who wanted to use his power for good. I think that's a wonderful idea, she said softly. When do we start? Soon. But first we have a royal reception to attend. We'll need to present a united front. Show the Queen and everyone else that we're not just partners in revenge, but partners in everything. I like the sound of that. He pulled her onto his lap, settling her against his chest. You know what I like? What? This. You. The fact that I get to come home to you every night. That you're mine and I'm yours and we don't have to hide it or apologize for it. Very possessive, Your Grace. Always. He pressed a kiss to her temple. I've waited too long for you to be anything but possessive. Lavinia settled more comfortably against him, feeling safe and cherished and utterly content. 20 years ago, she'd been too afraid to take a chance on this man. But she wasn't afraid anymore. And the life they were building together, a life of partnership and purpose and passionate devotion, was worth every moment of the wait. The royal reception was as intimidating as Lavinia had feared. Buckingham Palace was overwhelming in its grandeur, and the assembled guests were a who's who of British aristocracy and political power. Lavinia wore her finest gown, sapphire silk that matched her engagement ring, and the Redmoor diamonds that proclaimed her status as Duchess. She felt like an imposter, but she held her head high and her hand steady on Cassian's arm. When they were presented to Queen Victoria, the small, formidable woman studied them both with keen intelligence. Your Graces, she said, We are pleased to finally meet you. Your marriage has been the subject of much discussion. I hope the discussion has been favorable, Your Majesty, Cassian said smoothly. It has been varied. The Queen's lips twitched. Some say the Duke of Redmoor has finally lost his mind. Others say he's made the shrewdest match of his life. We find ourselves curious which is true. Lavinia felt Cassian's hand tighten on hers. With respect, Your Majesty, Lavinia said, finding her voice. I believe it's both. The Queen's eyebrows rose. Both. My husband has loved me for 20 years, despite all reason and logic. That could certainly be considered a form of madness. But I also bring him something no amount of money or strategic alliance could buy, someone who sees him as a man, not just a title, who challenges him and refuses to be intimidated by him. I'd say that makes our match rather shrewd indeed. For a moment, the Queen simply stared at her. Then she smiled. A genuine smile that transformed her usually severe expression. We like you, Duchess. You have spirit and intelligence. Your husband is fortunate. I'm the fortunate one, Your Majesty, Cassian said quietly. Yes, the Queen agreed. You are. See that you remember it. As they moved away from the royal presence, Lavinia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That went better than expected, she murmured. You were magnificent. I was terrified. But you did it anyway. That's what makes you magnificent. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Everywhere they went, people watched them with curiosity, speculation, and in some cases, barely concealed envy. The Duke of Redmoor had always been unreachable, untouchable. But now he had a weakness, a wife he clearly adored. Some would see that as an opportunity. They would be wrong. Because Cassian's devotion to Lavinia didn't make him weak. It made him more dangerous. Anyone who threatened her would face the full weight of his wrath. And Lavinia had discovered that she was quite comfortable with that arrangement. On the carriage ride home, Cassian was quiet. What are you thinking? Lavinia asked. That I'm glad this is over. That I can take you home and be ourselves again instead of performing for society. You don't like performing? I despise it. I always have. He looked at her. The only reason I tolerate these events is because you're beside me now. That makes them bearable. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Two people who never fit society's expectations, forced to navigate its rules anyway. We don't have to navigate anything we don't want to. We're powerful enough now to make our own rules. Are we? Yes. His voice was absolute. We are. And it's time we started acting like it. When they arrived home, Cassian dismissed the servants and led Lavinia upstairs himself. In their private apartments, away from prying eyes and social obligations, he pulled her into his arms. I love you, he said, more than I've ever been able to properly express. You are the only thing in this world that matters to me. That's a lot of pressure to put on one person. Can you handle it? She looked up at him. This man who had waited 20 years for her, who had built an empire and toppled enemies and loved her with frightening intensity. Yes, she said, I can handle it, because you're the only thing that matters to me too. Then we're even. We're mad. That too. He kissed her, and Lavinia felt the last of her doubts fall away. This was her life now, her choice, her future, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. Epilogue. 5 years later, Lavinia stood in the same gardens at Redmoor Hall where she'd stood that spring day, contemplating her new life. So much had changed. The educational programs she and Cassian had established were thriving. Dozens of children from tenant families were now receiving schooling. Widows and unmarried women had been given positions in the estate's workshops, learning trades that would support them. Lavinia had discovered she had a talent for organization and management, for seeing what needed to be done and making it happen. She'd also discovered she had a voice, and people listened when she spoke. The Duchess of Redmoor had become known not just as the wife of the feared Duke, but as a force in her own right. And Cassian had mellowed, slightly. He was still cold to the outside world, still ruthless in business, still utterly devoted to her. But there was a peace about him now that hadn't been there before. The revenge was over. They'd spent the first year of their marriage systematically dismantling everyone who had wronged Lavinia, and then they'd stopped. Because revenge, while satisfying, wasn't a foundation to build a life on. Love was. Lavinia heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Cassian approaching, just as he had that day 5 years ago. But this time he wasn't alone. A small child toddled beside him, gripping his hand. Their daughter, Charlotte, 3 years old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's intelligent eyes. "Mama!" Charlotte called, and Lavinia scooped her up, pressing kisses to her soft cheek. "There's my girl. Have you been keeping Papa busy?" "Very busy," Cassian said dryly. She insisted on inspecting every flower in the garden. "She's thorough, like her father, and stubborn, like her mother." Lavinia laughed. Charlotte squirmed to be put down and ran off to chase a butterfly. Cassian wrapped his arms around Lavinia from behind, just as he had that day 5 years ago. "Happy?" he asked. "Absurdly. No regrets. Only that I didn't say yes 20 years ago. But then we wouldn't have Charlotte, so perhaps everything happened exactly as it should." "I waited 20 years for you," he said softly. "And I'd wait 20 more if I had to. You were always worth it." Lavinia leaned back against him, watching their daughter play in the spring sunshine. "I love you," she said, "more than I ever thought possible." "I know. I love you too." They stood there together, watching their child laugh and play, and Lavinia realized that this ordinary moment of domestic happiness was the real revenge. Not against the people who had mocked her, but against the fear that had ruled her life for so long. She had refused to let fear make her choices anymore. And she had gained everything. The end.